So my dissertation is entitled Fire Moss, an Understudied Community and Potential Tool for Post-Fire Rehabilitation. Here we can see a mixed conifer forest that has been very recently devastated by a high severity wildfire. Some of the impacts are direct impacts such as tree death, soil burn, so that reduces soil cover and creates large patches of bare soil, potentially creating impacts for erosion, as well as impacts on soil biotic communities, big impacts on soil biotic communities. So here in the Southwest, we've seen increases. This is a publication from Megan Singleton outlining increases in burned area. So these are actually log scales. So imagine a curve actually going up exponentially when you see these increases from in the last 30 years, from 1985 to 2015, as well as quite dramatic increases in the rates of high severity fire. So this creates a situation where land managers need new tools to restore post-fire. A lot of the research here in the Southwest has been focusing on restoring the vascular plant community. So here's a paper from Savage and Mass kind of outlining that need for restoration. Lisa Floyd using seeding of native grass species in Mesa Verde. Donna Pepin looking at how the how seeding has been effective or has been ineffective post-fire, as well as Jesse Utz looking at planting of ponderosa pine species in Arizona and New Mexico. Some soil organisms have actually shown promise. So here's a publication looking at whether or not fungi might have a role as soil stabilizers after fire. And then Julie Korb had a really interesting paper where she added both seed and live soil inoculum from an unburned location and saw big increases in plant cover, both of native forb cover and native graminoid cover after fire. So there's a lot of promise for these smaller species. The species that I'm looking for, I'm looking at are the fire mosses. They consist of Funaria hygrometrica, Bryum argenteum, and Ceratodon purpureus. So as you can see, we have both the gametophyte life form as well as the sporophyte life form in this picture. So the gametophyte's actually the carpet-forming section of the moss down low, and the sporophyte is the sexual reproducing body that allows these mosses to reproduce and proliferate as quickly as they can. To go into a little bit more detail about what is known about fire mosses, I put together this graph of publications that are both looking at post-fire and moss. So it had to be specific to the post-fire environment. As you can see, Australia has really pioneered some of this work. These works were in Tasmania, actually, one research group really focusing on both kind of specific locations where they were seeing this post-fire phenomenon, as well as some of the functional increases, such as nitrogen fixation. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Europe saw a lot of publication in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But then more recently, there's been a lot more interest in this topic here in North America. And in the Southwest, we've actually only had one publication, and that is Chris Ives' thesis. He examined the potential to actually restore these, such as the same as I'm doing. So he was kind of pioneering this research for me. So they recolonize landscapes very quickly, the fire mosses. This is a publication from Tasmania. It's showing percentage of cover of first bare soil, and then different species recolonizing after fire. And then this is time since fire. So Marchantia is actually a liverwort that you can see in really mesic conditions. When I go up to Washington, you see a lot of Marchantia recolonizing post-fire. Moss protonema are little structures that mosses, are filamentous structures that mosses create to reproduce asexually. So once the spores, it's an intermediate body. Once the spores locate on the soil surface, they grow into protonema before you get the gametophyte structures. And then we see Funaria hygrometrica, as well as Ceratodon purpureus. So some reasons that might make these fire mosses really good at colonizing post-fire, and then potentially also as restoration tools. First, they produce many, many spores, allowing for long-distance dispersal. Some publications have actually shown that there's really no propagule limitation to spores. They can travel intercontinentally. They've been seen in Antarctica and all over many different continents. So here is the life cycle of Funaria. It's actually an annual that can, or a short-lived perennial that can complete its entire life cycle within 1 year. So it starts out as a spore. Here's that protonematal phase, and then it reproduces and creates a sporophyte and creates more spores in less than 1 year. Ceratodon and Bryum are actually a little bit more long-lived and take a little bit longer time to fully reproduce sexually. But Bryum in particular actually has fragments and specialized structures, rhizoidal tubers, bulbils, and gemmae that can really increase the rates of colonization and local dispersal. So these structures, once the moss has grown a little bit, it creates these structures, and those break off and create more Bryum species, or more Bryum plants throughout the surrounding landscape. These mosses are also desiccation tolerant. So Funaria is desiccation tolerant when this abscisic acid, it's a plant hormone, has been added to it. Both Ceratodon and Bryum have been shown to be desiccation tolerant for a very long time. Finally, they can aggregate soils, reducing erosion. Here's a study from Silva et al. In Portugal, looking at how mosses might be reducing erosion on small runoff plots. Here we can see a plot in late October where there's no moss cover, and then that same plot occurring in mid-March where fire mosses have colonized the land, or this little plot, quite dramatically, and are reducing erosion quite dramatically as well. Then they can host microbes that fix nitrogen. So this is that publication from Tasmania that I was speaking about. Here, Funaria actually has moss, has nostoc, as well as filamentous cyanobacteria that is colonizing its surface. And that might allow the increase of nitrogen post-fire, increasing soil fertility and allowing other species to recolonize more easily. I want to leave you with a bird's eye view of developing fire moss as a restoration technology. I tried to first explore the natural distribution and function of these mosses on natural landscapes. This would give us a good idea of where and when and potentially how much function would be allowed by these fire mosses if we were able to restore them, would be provided. Second, these mosses, because they're so ruderal and transient, finding a proper source of propagules, a proper source of the moss itself to be able to restore it actively was important. And so developing a culturing technique, being able to grow these mosses is really important to successful restoration. With that information together, we were able to test restoration potential and then integrated with existing restoration framework. So there's a lot of post-fire restoration tools already in use, and we wanted to make sure that we were working within that framework to make our work more relevant. So first, I'm going to look into exploring that natural distribution and function. I had two driving questions. When and where are mosses colonizing burned landscapes? And do mosses have restoration value? To explore that first question, we did a natural survey on 10 fires here in the Southwest. This is Flagstaff, where we are. Bob's all the way over in Bernalillo. And so this is the Santa Fe National Forest in New Mexico, as well as down in the Apache Sitgraves National Forest. We looked at 2 fires, San Juan and Wall of Fire. We tried to look at range of time since fire. So the oldest fire was the Schultz fire up just near Flagstaff here. And then the youngest fire were these managed fires, the Pivot Rock and the Jack fire that occurred down here just south of Flagstaff. Each fire, we extracted high burn severity pixels. So we were interested in looking at specifically high burn severity because we saw that's where the most negative impacts of the fire occur. We then stratified by winter insolation and elevation using cluster analysis. So each one of these colors is actually a cluster where we divided up the environmental space to create different locations where we might see moss colonization in different environmental locations. We then selected plots that maximize that environmental diversity. So here would be a low elevation, low insolation plot. So think about a north facing low elevation plot. And then this would be the alternate high insolation plot. So south versus north facing slopes. At each plot, we set up 2 transects on contour and 20 meters apart. We collected line intercept data of moss cover. And if no mosses were on the transects, we actually implemented a time search because we were interested in seeing whether, and being able to differentiate places where there was no moss at all to very low cover, which turned out to be quite important. So here we see a very, very high cover fire moss plot. So this is on the San Juan fire, and it you can see on you can see all the vascular plants growing up, but actually on the soil surface, all that red in the background of the vascular plants is actually fire moss covering the landscape and providing function. We were able to visit 65 plots throughout those 10 fires. The mean fire moss cover was 11.2%, and the median was 3.5%, with a range of 0 to 72.9%. So as you can see, there's a high skew towards very low cover plots. And so it's good that we had that time search to be able to explore those. But there are locations where fire moss is a dominant feature in terms of soil surface cover. To explore this data a little closer, we chose 11 potential predictors of landscape scale moss cover. We used random forests to model and determine variable importance, and here's an output of that modeling effort. First, we used equinox insolation. We decided to switch to equinox insolation from winter solstice insolation. This allowed us to examine areas with really steep terrain without having very low values on north-facing slopes. If in the winter, right, there's locations that just don't see sunlight at all, and those all kind of blend together. The next most important predictor was pre-fire soil carbon, followed by vegetation type, precipitation, time since fire, elevation, equinox insolation at 9 a.m., which is actually a good indicator of east versus west facing slopes. This being important because east facing slopes get sunlight early on, which might dry mosses out kind of earlier in the day when they're moist from dew. Geologic map unit was a predictor of edaphic conditions. We decided to use this very coarse predictor because it was kind of encompassing many different things. And then slope, pH, and topographic wetness index were some very unimportant predictors. The initial model actually described about a third of the variation in the data. And so that was exciting, but we did a model selection technique. We were actually able to describe even more 0.37 R squared with an optimized model that selected only the most important and unique predictors. So equinox insolation, pre-fire vegetation type, pre-fire soil carbon, and time since fire turned out to have unique information on fire, on moss colonization post-fire. To go into more detail, we used accumulated localized effects plots to visualize the main effects of each of the predictors, of those important predictors. So here we have moss cover on the y-axis, and then each different predictor on the x-axis. Each one of the dots is actually a plot. So this kind of allows us to both look at how the model is doing as well as the variation across different locations. So as you can see, there's a negative relationship between equinox insolation and moss cover. This was pretty unsurprising. We saw high rates of moss cover on shady north-facing slopes, and then lower rates on sunny south-facing slopes where mosses would probably dry out a lot faster and reduce the growing time. We also saw that pre-fire vegetation type was important, and mesic mixed conifer forests tend to be the locations where we saw the highest moss cover. This was followed by ponderosa pine forest types, and then dry to mesic mixed conifer forests. This was a little bit interesting of a result. We would have expected to see dry to mesic mixed conifer forests having higher moss cover than ponderosa pine, but I think this is mostly due to the fact that all of these dry to mesic mixed conifer forests, except one, were located on the Schultz fire, which ended up being our oldest fire as well. So there's kind of a just an artifact of our data set that's driving that situation. Then we saw that pre-fire soil carbon was important and positively related to moss cover. So there were these very low values of moss cover at kind of low intermediate values of soil carbon. And then there's this huge spike at kind of 24 to 32% soil carbon. And this is carbon at the soil surface. So I think this is actually connecting to litter and duff layers that are occurring that are thicker and stronger at the soil surface, and might have to do with either climate, that a more productive ecosystem would be creating a more robust litter and duff layer, or potentially it would have to do with burn severity, right? So a higher layer, a more robust layer of litter and duff would burn at a higher severity, and that could create a preferentially colonize, a location where mosses would preferentially colonize that area. And then finally, time since fire was a good predictor. We saw that really there was no moss cover before 2 years post-fire. And then there's this dramatic increase followed by gradual decrease. This decrease is probably due to the fact that vascular plants are recolonizing and outcompeting these mosses post-fire. And then we have some anecdotal evidence to kind of show that we might not have seen the cover that could occur less than 2 years post-fire. So I think the natural survey, those two fires, the Pivot Rock and the Jack Fire that we explored, were held in relatively low or relatively flat terrain, and didn't see very high, very large patches of high burn severity. They were actually fires managed for ecosystem benefit. And I think this kind of led to that artificially depressed amount of soil or of fire moss colonization in those first 2 years. Here we have moss colonization on both the Boundary Fire, and then this is the Cajete Fire, two fires that I'll talk about when we are exploring the fire moss field plot inoculation. And as you can see, there's relatively high moss cover. This one's a little more difficult to see, but this is actually completely covered in Bryum argenteum post-fire. And so I think we just kind of missed that window. We map moss cover and predictors on the slide fire. So here we have a map of moss cover only in the high soil burn severity locations. We actually pulled those out because we were interested in mapping those specifically. We saw that this kind of allowed us to look at interactions between predictors. So here we have an area where low insolation is occurring, as well as high soil organic carbon, and that maps to quite high percent moss cover in that location. But then if we go over to this location, kind of on the south slope of this canyon, we can see there's low insolation, but there's also quite low soil organic carbon, and that relates to, that predicts quite a bit lower moss cover. So, I looked at those main effects, but really the interactions are very important of different variables. So next, we examined whether or not mosses have restoration value. At each one of those plots that I described, we collected paired moss and bare soil microsite measurements. So here we have a moss-covered microsite right next to a bare microsite. We looked at soil aggregate stability using this Hornada experimental range test kit. We looked at penetration resistance. We looked at shear strength or resistance to shear using a Tor vane. And then using a mini disc infiltrometer, we looked at infiltration. We saw a dramatic increase in function for all of the different functions, the change from bare to moss. So this y-axis is actually showing that percent change from a bare microsite to a moss microsite, and then each one, the confidence intervals are bootstrap confidence intervals of that percent change across the across all those paired microsites. So we saw 50% increase in infiltration, 100% increase in shear strength, 150% increase in compressive strength, and almost 200% increase in aggregate stability. The infiltration results actually don't agree with a lot of 1 by 1 millimeter runoff plots. So at Silva et al. Publication, I showed you a picture of that in the introduction, and they didn't really see a dramatic increase in infiltration. They're actually measuring runoff, and they saw almost no change. So I think kind of re-examining that at larger scales is going to be valuable to exploring or to understanding how mosses might impact on a watershed level runoff and post-fire impact, and mitigate post-fire impacts. And I think the same is true for some of these microsite measurements in terms of erosion resistance. When we get very large impacts, these numbers might not hold up quite as well. So in conclusion, we saw that cover can be quite high, but is highly variable. Equinox insolation, pre-fire forest type, pre-fire soil carbon, and time since fire were important drivers. And then moss provides function at likely larger scales, but that needs to be tested. Finally, I think managers should monitor for moss recovery in burned areas and try to avoid actions that might reduce that cover, because it is a valuable restoration, or it is a valuable form of cover out there that occurs quite quickly. Second, we developed a culturing technique. So 2 driving questions of creating that cultivation technique were what substrates grow mosses quickly in the greenhouse, and how can we economically scale cultivation? We used a technique pioneered by Doherty et al. 2015, which allows for mosses to be grown in many experimental study units, and we replaced the sand. So in his technique, we were water is actually wicked up from below using kind of wicking sand to provide that water from below. And we replaced that sand with this rock wool hydroponic wicking cloth. This allowed for trials of different substrates. So because we could put the substrate right on top, and it and the moss would have water wicking towards it constantly, we could experiment with those different substrates. We had treatment factors in this experiment of species. So we examined Bryum and Funaria hygrometrica because they were the most functionally different and also quite early successional species. And then we added them together to examine whether or not we might have competition or facilitation between the two. We also examined these main substrates. So organic substrate, this is actually a product that I was able to pick up at Home Depot. It's a Miracle-Gro organic soil product. It doesn't actually have any mineral soil in it. And then we also added coconut coir, an organic matter, a form of organic matter, to that wicking sand to see if that would grow mosses. To add post-fire elements to this, we thought maybe potential soil amendments of charcoal, ash, or both of them together could really increase the moss cover and just increase growth rates. And we also were interested kind of examining that scaling up. We were interested in whether or not we could more easily restore mosses or more easily harvest the mosses by putting a layer of burlap fabric on each of the plots. So here we have the charcoal amendment and then the ash amendment here, and then both. Our best treatments were approaching maximum cover after 2 months. This was really exciting because we saw such a fast growth rate compared to a lot of other biocrusts, which can take up to 4 months to grow. So this means, we could turn around moss cultivation quite quickly and cultivate moss quite fast. So unamended organic soil grew mosses the best. And that was also really nice because it is a relatively simple recipe for good moss growth. Charcoal also increased Bryum argenteum success. But burlap didn't really simplify harvesting at all. It actually made the mosses stick to the burlap instead of the soil. So that could be useful at some point for some sort of moss cloth, but we were interested in kind of adding moss as fragment, so it made it harder to restore or to harvest. So here is kind of the breakdown of all these different factors. Here we have the species factors at different panels, and then the 2 substrates, and in the different colors are the amendments. As you can see, the organic substrate worked well for all species factors. And then ash, any plot that had ash on it seem to have a quite inhibitory effect. We examined the pH of the soils directly after or directly before we set up the experiment, and we saw pHs up near 10 or more. And so I think the alkalinity of the ash, like being added directly to this this area, really changed the really changed and inhibited that moss growth. To upscale greenhouse cultivation, we added a row cover. So here you can see row cover kind of that you would use, you know, in a garden to try to trap moisture. And we did the same thing here. It also stabilized kind of the climate. So this really increased the growth rate, and we recommend doing that in the future. We also added a weed cloth. So as you can see down low here, there's this plastic covering underneath the soil, that organic substrate, and that was placed directly in between the substrate and the rock wool. And so that allowed us to pull the entire substrate and moss off the cultivation system quickly and then dry everything separately, allowing us to start a new cultivation system immediately. And mosses actually need to be dried slowly to create that desiccation tolerance, to allow for that desiccation tolerance to occur. So, so after these kind of tweakings of the different situations, we were able to increase the moss growth rate a little bit. To test restoration potential in the field and also integrate it with existing framework, we looked at two major driving questions. How can we establish fire mosses in the field? And then, does increased cover provide additional function? We went out with the boundary, or with the Kaibab National Forest and the Coconino National Forest. This is Kit McDonald, and back there is Mike Akiso from the Kaibab on the boundary fire, which is just north of here on Kendrick Peak, Arizona. This is Kit doing a water droplet penetration time test. So this allowed us to examine areas of high soil, or find areas of high soil burn severity, as well as kind of allowed me to understand, you know, how this restoration technique might have to occur in the post-fire timeline to be effective. We ended up selecting this location. So this was a plantation that burned in higher soil burn severity, and it really was a different location, different style of burn severity from, you can see the surrounding vegetation was much more patchy, and this was much more continuous. It also was the pumpkin fire, or was within the pumpkin fire boundary. So it's actually a reburn, which might have had some impacts on the moss colonization results, the success of our field trials. But this was the most easily accessible and one of the few fires that we saw high burn severity in during this fire season. Immediately after adding crushed up moss to the ground, we saw ants just picking up the moss and moving it off the plot. When I had added when I finished the final plot, I was out there with Pete. We went back to the first plot where we had added moss, and we could see absolutely no moss on the soil surface. So that was sad, and he said he thought it was probably the most expensive moss or ant food you could possibly come up with. To try to reduce this predation, we ground moss to a small size and make it less desirable. This could potentially have detrimental effects of making it so small that propagules would have lower survivorship. But we also pelletized moss. So this has been a successful treatment at reducing predation for seeds in restoration techniques. So here you can see the different little size pellets. And then this is a 1 by 1 meter plot showing where we added all the pellets to. We created these pellets by rolling the moss up in diatomaceous earth. So diatomaceous earth is actually a insecticide when it's dry, and it also is small enough that it really binds things together. We also included in this mix the substrate that we were growing the mosses on. After 1 week, this is what the pellets looked like. It had actually rained quite a bit. It was right at the beginning of monsoon season, and this melted the pellets to the soil surface and really was promising. It seemed like it would increase the ability for them to stay in place and grow better. Colonization was successful, but cover really remained quite low. Here, on this plot, you can see on the x-axis, we have the time of inoculation on this black bar, and then that's followed by different monitoring time points. We explored moss cover, as well as the number of moss colonies per 1 by 1 meter plot. This was to examine whether or not we might see a bunch of colonies that could potentially grow into quite a bit more cover in the future. Then finally, I added this plot of Palmer Drought Severity Index. So red is a more exceptional or extreme drought. And you can see here in the winter of 2017, 2018, and through the summer of 2018, we saw this exceptional drought that really dampened a lot of our success. Pelletization was quite successful. We saw high rates of pellet colonies, and then much higher and significantly higher rates of cover. And this was specific only to Bryum argenteum. We didn't see any Funaria or Ceratodon on these trials. So it seemed like there was potential for mosses to take off, but right as that was occurring, this extreme drought happened. In a different location on the Jemez Mountains of New Mexico, we added pelletized moss, or we had a different trial 4 months post-fire. So this was starting in November, and that was really examining whether or not winter precipitation might increase moss cover. And also, as you can see, this was just recently burned. It is not one of those burns that had occurred, where a high severity burn had occurred in the semi-recent past. We saw natural Bryum colonization and avoided it to reduce kind of confounding results, but it was exciting to see this. We saw, because of that, there was potential that we could grow mosses on our own here and establish them well. We switched the grind treatment, which wasn't showing much success, to pellets at 5 times the volume of the other treatment. So this potentially would allow us to increase moss colonization and see if we could actually see function. We could test the function after a couple of years if this grew quite well to get at that final driving question. Pellets were still visible 6 months later due to that same extreme drought that occurred over in New Mexico as well. So this is a picture 6 months after that last picture I showed you. So it did protect the moss, but that drought was just so extreme and exceptional that we saw almost no moss cover or colonies at all that first season, or that first monitoring time point. It was incredible that once the monsoon season started and we did start to get some precipitation, the pelletized at high volume, the 5 times pelletized, we did see increased cover there compared to other treatments. So the red is the control. And this was really exciting because we ended up having a lot more, these species were somewhat resilient to that drought, right? They weren't able to grow during it, but they didn't actually completely die, Bryum in particular. This difference, although somewhat strong, was not quite strong enough for us to be able to test the function. So I like to kind of wrap this up by thinking about this seminal paper that Matt put together, looking at BioCrest as a rehabilitation opportunity. We saw that he outlines different barriers to potential restoration success. First being actively eroding soils, then resource limitation, propagule scarcity, and then if the propagules are present, right, time could increase successful rehabilitation. I wanted to update that figure, that conceptual model, by adding in this battle between Mossman from Masters of the Universe and them, giant ants. So as you can see, this would probably occur right around where the propagules become available. And I think it's less of a battle and more of kind of encapsulating Mossman in a little pellet and trying to reduce the ant from destroying him. I also wanted to talk a little bit more about pelletization technique and how it might integrate with other restoration frameworks. So being able to scale up these results was really important to me, and that was one of the reasons I decided to explore pelletization. First, there are a lot of issues with post-fire seeding where different densities of seeds will separate in hoppers within airplanes. Kind of the vibration of the airplane as it's flying around will separate the different seeds to different sizes, and it makes it really hard to seed evenly of different species. So I think this pelletization technique could get around that. It could also get around the issue of jamming in drill seeders. So seed drills are also used for post-fire restoration, and mosses are so light that they're likely to jam as well. Doherty et al. 2019 actually saw that when they were trying to add mosses via seed drill. And so I think creating a little bit more weight, creating a larger propagule size could get around some of that. We could also explore many other pelletization approaches. It's been examined and they've seen success of different pelletization approaches in the seeding world. And so stealing from that would be super valuable. Also, I think exploring this pelletization in other ecosystem types, right? The vast majority of BioCrest restoration is occurring in drylands. And so I think just seeing whether or not this technique could work in that situation could be quite valuable. In conclusion, we can grow fire mosses in the greenhouse quite rapidly. We can establish Bryum argenteum using pellets, but we haven't had success with the other species. I think this is potentially due to those specialized structures that I talked about right at the beginning. So Bryum having those structures might have allowed it to persist and also grow and also establish much more easily than Ceratodon and Funaria. And I think examining the role of spores, of adding mosses via spores could really increase success. How do greenhouse grown mosses perform under favorable precipitation? I think we should really explore this a little bit more. Those exceptional droughts might have really dampened that success, and I think it'd be important to test this once again under better conditions. And then finally, that question of how does greenhouse grown moss contribute to function? We weren't able to test that with the relatively low success we saw. In conclusion, I created a fact sheet that is available at the Southwest Fire Science Consortium. It's live right now on that website. And so if you would like to, share this information with anybody else, it's just a 2-page, really quick fact sheet. But feel free to go check that out and send it to whoever you wish. So I'd like to thank all the funding agencies that provided funding for me for this dissertation. So the ARCS Foundation, Bias Caldera, the McIntyre Stennis Foundation from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, everybody at the School of Forestry, as well as the Joint Fire Science Program. And then finally, I'd like to thank everybody who has contributed and really supported me throughout this time. It's been an incredible collaborative experience. All the folks from the Bowker and Johnson Lab, my committee members, the entire School of Forestry, who's just been such a great, such a wonderful community to be part of, as well as the land managers who provided permitting support and taught me kind of the realities of post-fire restoration. And then finally, all the collaborators and technicians who really made this work possible. Thank you.
We'll break the video back up.
Henry, would you like to manage your own questions?
Sure.
I did notice there is one from Paul Byer in the chat box.
All right. Hey, Paul. So we actually used that soil grids modeling technique, and we extracted the pre-fire carbon from that soil grid. So it was a modeling technique, and we tried to use the kind of the early on modeling technique, the early on model of that. So I think it is less valuable than kind of, taking pre-fire carbon measurements, but it was kind of the only information that was available to us. Taking pre-fire carbon measurements directly, but it was kind of the only information that was available. I think that's kind of the only question I have. Does anybody else have a question that they'd just like to ask directly?
Bob Parmenter has one in the chat box. I can unmute him if I could find it.
So this is actually pretty interesting. He asks about the elk herds in the Jemez Mountains and how they might have kind of impacted negatively or positively the moss colonization. And there's a cool paper from Quebec that shows that in post-fire environments, hoof prints, create these little micro topography situations that can really be preferentially colonized. We actually also saw a lot of moss being colonized on burned out stump holes. So this could be due to, little microsites or also higher burn severity in those stump holes. But when I was looking at some of my field trials, you would see, if there was a really nice imprint of a elk footprint. I mostly saw this up on Kendrick Peak in Arizona. We would see, a bunch of moss just growing right in that footprint post fire. So they can definitely disturb the moss, and I think we also saw that situation where a herd will have come through and really kicked everything up and disturbed moss that's already colonized, but it can also really decrease, or it can also really create favorable microsites for that fire or for moss colonization.
Quick question. Do you have any evidence that there's much genetic variation in the different species that might make them better or worse in growing in the different environments that you studied?
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. So there's some really cool papers that show, mosses, these fire mosses in particular, and how pretty much all of their genetic variation is driven by environmental variables. So, if you look, they're relatively similar in terms of the continental scale differences between the species. But then there was a couple of publications in Europe that examine mosses after these mosses in particular at kind of steep environmental gradients, and showed pretty different genetic makeups of those different mosses. So I think that really like shows that they could potentially be that's the main driver of their distribution. We saw a little bit more Bryum on south-facing slopes in that natural survey. So I think it could potentially be, and it's also been known to colonize, drylands in Moab area, in the Colorado Plateau and other regions, as well as it's very common in drylands in China. And so it makes sense that would be one of the more drought kind of resistant, or it would preferentially colonize drier locations. Robert Stevenson has a question about the weedy life histories, and yeah, these are quite a bit. They're incredibly weedy, kind of ruderal species compared to a lot of other mosses. They're not only increasers post-fire, but they've been shown to kind of increase after many different disturbances. I've actually, it was really fun kind of throughout my dissertation going around. You could almost always, like in somebody's backyard, in a little like disturbed location, you could find Bryum, even on like the East Coast or somewhere like that, or in a sidewalk crack. So when I was talking to somebody about my research, it was always fun to kind of try to hunt for it, because there's so much kind of disturbance around where people are, that you can find Bryum and other species and the other fire moss species. So that's really cool.
I have a question kind of relating to Nancy's. So thinking about how genetics of the same species and the environment really drives their success, I'm wondering where did you collect the mosses that you used in the greenhouse, which you then distributed not all over, but did you get local sourced mosses, or was it kind of from one spot in Arizona and things like that?
Yeah, thanks, Becky. We did. We tried to get local sources. It was, the timeline was so short to try to create restoration, to put the mosses down post-fire, that we weren't able to get something that was immediately adjacent. But for the boundary fire, we collected moss from the Schultz fire, or from the slide fire, I mean. So that was relatively local. I think it was a quite a similar ecosystem type. And then when I collected moss second in the Jemez Mountains, we tried to actually collect it on a more south-facing slope to try to kind of create the potential, or if we got kind of a flatter, warmer microsite, which we ended up seeing in that boundary, or in that Jemez Mountain study, we'd have moss that would be, adapted to those kind of conditions. I think that's maybe one of the reasons we did see so much Bryum in the Jemez Mountains too, was, our moss mix was kind of high in Bryum. So.
I'm gonna ask a question. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So Henry, I thought that was great, and actually you kept my 8-year-old daughter enthralled, so good job with that.
All right.
She listened
Thanks,
to
Julia.
her first full defense, so congrats to you, Henry.
All right.
My question was about, you mentioned that your mini disc infiltrometer measurements didn't match up well with the runoff plots. I was just curious what you think about that, and are we measuring infiltration correctly, or is there something we should be doing different than what we're doing now?
Well, I think just those point scale measurements, and also, infiltration, the mini disc infiltrometer is a tension infiltrometer. And so that kind of specifically is examining kind of micropore infiltration, and doesn't really look quite as well at the macropores. And so I think those could be really driving a lot of infiltration. So we're missing that component. But I think also, you know, the fact that the infiltrometer is really just holding that water right there, and it's all about whether or not it's getting sucked into the soil surface, doesn't really allow us to examine runoff quite as easily, right? So the potential for on steeper slopes where a lot of the erosion issues would be occurring, it's important to kind of examine, you know, whether or not the mosses would really potentially create a more water repellent soil surface when they're dry. And that, I think, could have been driving the differences in success that we saw, or the differences in function that we saw between those studies.
Okay. Thanks everyone for attending. We're at about 10 o'clock. Thanks for all the great questions. The committee needs to chat with Henry again in another meeting. But you're all audible, so let's tell Henry what we thought of his presentation.
Hey.
Everyone.
Good job, Henry.